I want to talk for a minute about how the Web API routes URLs. If you've had some experience with the MVC framework, you already kind of have a point of reference because the MVC framework, or really the MVC pattern, uses URL routing. In other words, it takes the URL and it uses the sections to determine which controller should return the response and which action in the controller, which method in the controller should actually process that URL, which code should actually run. And the Web API works very similarly, but there are some key differences that can trip you up, especially if you're heavily into the MVC framework. When we talk about routing, all we're really talking about is the interpretation of URLs by the server to decide what code should handle the request. All these different URLs are going to come at the server from all these different clients, and the URLs themselves are how the server is going to decide what code to answer that request with. Operates very similarly to ASP.NET MVC routing, like I said. Now here's the kicker. The actions are determined by the HTTP method that's used. And if you're an MVC person, this can really throw you because you're used to thinking of the action name probably being in the URL. The Web API just does not work that way. It abides by a very strict REST pattern. So you might have the exact same URL coming to the controller, but it's going to be the HTTP method that comes with that request that's going to tell the controller which method it should actually fire. So let's talk about how this is mapped by default. The way Microsoft has set up the mapping by default is pretty good. There's rarely a need to change it unless you just have specific requirements in your organization. The default mapping is configured in the global.asax, and once again, if you've used the MVC framework, this is old hat to you. You've actually seen this before because that's also where it does the MVC mapping. One of the differences is that it actually uses the word API as a URL segment. So when you have a URL, it's always /API/ whatever the rest of the URL is going to be. And the reason for this is the MVC framework also has a routing mechanism that's actually relatively similar to the Web API. And so when they put the Web API into the framework, they decided to hard code this piece of the URL so that there wouldn't be any kinds of conflicts. So if you had a controller that might route to the same URL coming in from the MVC framework as would come in from the Web API framework, then this word API would be the differentiator between the two. It also adds the word controller to the controller part of the URL. So for example, if we want the books controller to fire, then the URL is just going to say books in it. The Web API will automatically add the word controller to that segment and then look for that controller. So as you're making those controllers, keep that in mind. We generally name our controllers after the objects they deal with. So we're not thinking about sections of a website. We're thinking about resources that are being accessed via the web. So we're thinking about products and employees, and your controller names will sort of follow that same pattern. Finally, it looks for an action or a method name that begins with the HTTP method. Now, by default, it's going to set them up with get, post, put. I personally like to leave the method names the same as the HTTP names, just get, post, put, delete, because I think that's clearer. It links them up really nicely with the HTTP verbs. But you don't have to do that. If you want to call your methods things like get books or post books or edit existing book put existing book or what have you, you can do that just so long as the method name starts with the HTTP method that it corresponds to. If you have any additional URL parameters, they are going to be mapped as action parameters. So in your method, if you pass in an ID, then that first URL parameter at the end is going to be mapped to the ID. If you have 2 or 3 parameters, then it's going to look for these slashes in your URL where you fed it those parameters. But what if you want an alternative routing convention? What if the default isn't going to work for you? I want to point out that this is rarely necessary for most Web API services. Some people, they see the default routing convention, and boy, they just can't wait to customize it to their own environment. Developers are just this way, right? We love method names that we've come up with ourselves. We hate relying on a framework convention. But it really behooves you to think about whether you need to go messing around with it or not, because the default routing is very functional, and obviously you have to code a lot less, and it's pretty clear when you're following that normal convention. But if for some reason you do have to change the default way URL routing is handled in the Web API, they give you tons of options, and so it's very easy to pick the one that's going to work best for you. One of these ways is HTTP method attributes. If you've used the MVC framework before, you have seen these before. These attributes are very similar to their use in ASP.NET MVC. What you do is you take these attributes and you put them on the methods, and then the controller will always bind those methods to that HTTP method regardless of what your action name is. So for example, if I've got a method that says edit book, well, that's not going to bind to an HTTP method. There is no HTTP edit method. You use put for edits, right? So by default, my controller is looking for a method that starts with put. But if I want my method to be called edit books or edit products or whatever, I can do that by putting the actual HTTP method attribute on that method or on that action. Here's what those attributes look like. HTTP get, and you can probably predict how this is going to play out. So we have one for each verb, and if you just put this attribute on the method, the controller will always tie that method to this HTTP method. We also have the accept verbs attribute. It's another attribute. It works very similar. It's also used on actions, but instead of having an accept verbs for every HTTP method, you specify the HTTP method as strings. So we can use this if we are doing more than one HTTP method for the same action, or we can do this if we're using HTTP methods that are kind of atypical. So if you're not using get, put, post, or delete, you're using some other HTTP method, and there are others, then accept verbs is the way you want to go. This is what it looks like. You have the accept verbs attribute and then a comma-delimited list of strings that are the HTTP methods you want to bind to that controller action. If you want your naming to look more like MVC, you can put action names in the URL. And then your controller actions are mapped to them almost exactly the same way that they are in the MVC framework. It makes them route virtually identically. You still have that API in the beginning of the URL, but everything else is going to map just like the MVC framework. In order to do this, you've got to do a bit of heavy lifting. You actually have to go into the global.asax and change the code in the route template. And what you're looking for is the place where it actually has the route template, and you're actually going to add action into the template. You also have to add the HTTP method attributes that we covered earlier to the actions. Okay, so not only do you want to name it that way, you have to bind those method attributes to the actions in your controller as well. So it's kind of a lot of work, and not only is it a lot of work, but now you've moved further away from the REST pattern. And then we come to scenarios where you have actions that you don't want to be routed, but if you just left them in their normal form, the API framework would try to route to them. Usually it's because you have a name that starts with an HTTP method. And you don't actually want that to be tied to something. To remove an action from routing, it's very simple. All you have to do is use the actual attribute non-action. So when you have the non-action attribute, that method will not get routed to no matter what the HTTP method is or the URL or anything else that might normally get routed to that action by the Web API. Okay, so I want to take a look at how this routing actually plays out in code. Most of the times there's not a lot of code you need to mess with, but it's good to understand the guts of what's going on, just in case you do have to deal with the routing or you run into some kind of routing conflict that you need to fix. What I have here is the code for the global.asax. If you've used the MVC framework before, you are probably familiar with this block already, because this is the map route for the MVC framework. And you'll notice the template is when you have a URL, the controller comes first, then the action name, and then the ID. And this is how the MVC framework knows how to route its controllers and actions. So it will look for this controller. It'll look for some method that matches this, and then if you've passed an ID, then you've passed an ID, and that's great. But in the HTTP route, things go a little bit differently. Okay, this is the API mapping, and you'll notice that the template goes API as a hard-coded value, the controller name, and there's no action. Okay, there's just the optional ID parameter at the end. Because once again, by default, it's going to use the HTTP method name to figure out what action should fire. Okay, so when I look at an API controller, it's these method names that are going to determine which one is going to fire. So if I request this URL with the HTTP GET method, then it's going to fire this because this is the word GET. And if I fire the GET method with an ID on the end, it's going to fire this one because it's got an ID on the end and it matches this pattern. So it's these method names corresponding to the HTTP methods that actually tells the controller which bit of code to run. Now, once again, as I've said before, it only has to start with the method name. So I could do this and be just fine, just so long as it's starting with the corresponding HTTP method name. And this is the default routing. Once again, when it comes to the controller section, it's only going to take the word before the word controller. So the URL for this is API/books, not API/books controller. Right? It's automatically going to add that controller word on the end of it. So that's the way the default routing works. Fairly simple to use, except for a lot of people who are new, that whole thing about the HTTP method dictating the method that gets called, that can be kind of disorienting at first. So make sure that you have a good grip on that because that's really the heartbeat of this engine and that's what keeps it restful. Now you may need to change these, and changing them is relatively easy. Let's say, for example, that here in my edit method I think, well, put, that doesn't really tell somebody what this method does. I mean, put could mean anything. What I really want is a nice descriptive method name like editBook. Well, if I just change that name and I don't change anything else, this method is never going to get called because there is no HTTP method called edit. Right? There's just one called put. So one of my options is to use an HTTP verb. And so I can go up here and put HTTP put. And now, when I use this URL with the put HTTP method, it will look at this attribute and go ahead and run this code, even though the name doesn't match up. Very, very simple if for whatever reason you want your method names to be different. Now, if I want to tie a method to multiple HTTP methods, or I've got some unusual HTTP method that I want to support. Maybe I've got some proprietary client that uses a particular method that isn't normally used that much in HTTP. Then what I want to do is instead of this, I want to use accept verbs. And this is where I put my comma delimited list of HTTP verbs that I'm supporting. So I could do something like post, put. I can even put in really unusual ones like something like that. So these are all legitimate HTTP verbs. Now I'm tying multiples to this one method and even one that isn't normally routed by the WebAPI, and the method name has no bearing on how that routing is going to go. Now, one of the things that we also talked about is if you just really love the MVC routing and you want to have action names in your URLs and make it more like MVC and less like REST, you can do that, but this is where we're going to have to really monkey around with the configuration. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have to come back to global.asax and change the route template. I'm just going to comment that out for now. And so I've got API controller ID. What I'm going to do is add /action. You'll notice that this is almost identical to the MVC mapping now. The only difference is I've got API in front of it. And now my URLs will look exactly like MVC URLs, where I have the controller, I specify the action name, and whatever name I put in here, that's the method name that the API framework is going to look for. Once again, I just do not recommend this as a practice, because what's going to happen is now you've gotten way away from the HTTP pattern and the REST pattern, and you're limiting the clients that are going to know how to deal with this by default. So I highly recommend that you don't change it to have the action names in the URL. But if that's what you need to do and that's what your developers are used to working with, you can do that. Now, once I've made that change, I have to use these action verbs now anyway, so that it knows which HTTP method is going with that method. So even if you're changing to use the action names in the URL, you still got to do all the work to do this. So, once again, it's not really recommended unless that's just the way your organization has decided to work with URLs, and that's just what you're set on doing. So then finally, the last thing we talked about was actions that you don't want to be routed. Let's say I've got some method that this controller uses to do some data processing. Like, let's say I need to get tax rate for something. So maybe this is part of a price calculation or something in my controller. Now, I don't want to expose the get tax rate method. Okay. I don't want to expose this through my web API. I don't want it to be publicly consumable. Here, we just got a reprieve on taxes. I don't want this to be publicly consumable, but I want my controller to be able to use it. Well, notice that my method name here starts with get. And so by default, it's going to try to route to this because this is actually routed to the get method. I don't want that to happen, so I just simply put the non-action attribute here. And now, no matter what my naming convention is, this will absolutely not get routed by a URL. So all my helper methods, it's usually a good idea to just go ahead and slap this on there. Not only does it document them as helper methods, but it also makes sure that no matter how your names might change, or your naming conventions might change, this is just never going to get unintentionally exposed to the public. And that's how we can change the default routing conventions.